Good evening. My name is Judah Bernstein. I am Academic Programs Coordinator here at the Center for Jewish History, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this wonderful event hosted in partnership with the Cornell Jewish Studies program. The Center for Jewish History is the umbrella institution that houses 5 wonderful partnership organizations. They are the American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Together, these partners possess a trove of Jewish historical artifacts, documents, and other media that constitute the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel, possibly in Israel too, but we'll leave it at that for now. We don't want to, offend any Israelis in the room. The archival and library collections housed at the center span over 1,000 years. They constitute more than 5 miles of archival boxes, over 500,000 volumes of printed material, and feature dozens of languages stemming from manifold geographic locations. This is all to say that right here in this unassuming building on a quiet, sleepy street in Chelsea, Manhattan, any member of the public can walk through our doors, enter our Lillian Goldman reading room on the 3rd floor, and immerse themselves in the national and transnational histories of Jews across time periods. They could, if they so happen to have an interest in American Jewish labor history. Perhaps some of you in this room do. They could come in and peruse our many records held by our friends at YIVO and American Jewish Historical Society on trade unions, radicalism, working class social patterns, and other matters pertaining to the Triangle Fire. Certainly, the center is an archive and a portal for advanced research in Jewish history, but it is also a public institution, a Jewish Library of Congress. We see it as our mission to preserve the past so as to bring history alive every day. It is with that goal in mind that we organize and host events like the one this evening. If you happen to be curious about other center programming that mines the past in order to shed light on the present, please do have a look at our upcoming History Matters lectures, a placard of which you should have received upon entering the auditorium. If you did not receive one, they are available at our desks in the front. But without further ado, I would like to call up Alyssa Sampson, visiting scholar in the Cornell Jewish Studies program, to introduce this evening's event and its distinguished speakers. Please, Alyssa Sampson.
Good evening, and on behalf of Cornell Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you this evening to the Center for Jewish History, where we are with all our partners and exciting speakers, and introduce you to those speakers and those areas. So tonight, Cornell's Jewish Studies program and the School of Industrial and Labor Relations are honored to be co-hosting this event with the American Jewish Historical Society and the Center for Jewish History. This event reflects Jewish Studies' growing engagement with New York City's immigrant and labor history and its immigrant present. Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations has long been committed to documenting, researching, and teaching the Triangle Fire tragedy and advocating for the improvement of labor conditions. The history of the Triangle Fire has been part of its curriculum since the school opened in 1945. Our first speaker, Nick Salvatore, is the Maurice and Hinda Neufeld Founders Professor of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, where he arrived in 1981. He is the author of Eugene V. Debs. Take a step backwards. That's the same Debs as in what? W-E-V? Nice and loud. Come on. W-E-V-D. Yes. You're awake. Yes. We got it. Citizen and Socialist. We All Got History. The Memory Books of Amos Weber. And Singing in a Strange Land. C.L. Franklin, the Black Church, and the Transformation of America. Our second speaker, Ruth Sergel, is an artist who creates bold and compassionate works that bridge art and technology, memory, and wonder to incite social transformation. Ruth's work has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, Boston Museum of Fine Art, Corcoran Gallery of Art, National Museum of Women in the Arts, New York Historical Society, Gray Art Gallery, Anthology Film Archives, and 3LD Art Plus Technology Center. Her work has been internationally exhibited in Clermont-Ferrand, France, at the Shift Festival in Basel, and at the Théâtre de la Ville in Paris. Her first book, See You in the Streets, Art, Action, and Remembering the Triangle Fire, won a 2017 American Book Award. After they speak, Nick and Ruth will be joined on the podium for a panel discussion by Shel Barreto, who is the director of the Kiel Center for Labor Management, Documentation, and Archives. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hi. First, I would really like to thank Jonathan Boyarin and Alyssa Sampson for inviting me here tonight and for doing it over a wonderful lunch up at Cornell some weeks ago. As many of you know, the fire in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company broke out on March 25th, 1911, and took some 147 lives of the mostly female workers in that factory that produced women's clothing. The factory owners had locked one exit. The other exit, and the only other exit was the elevator, which the flames engulfed quite quickly, although the courageous efforts of the elevator operators, who made 3 very dangerous trips up to rescue as many as they could before that became impossible, did save some lives. Some of the desperate men and women trapped on the 9th and 10th floors then jumped into the elevator shaft, hoping to slide down the elevator cable, which proved to be far too hot for them to grasp. Others jumped from the 9th and 10th floor. It was not that the dangerous conditions at Triangle were unknown before this tragedy. 2 years earlier, a young Russian immigrant, Rose Schneiderman, led the workers at the Triangle factory on strike, protesting the very conditions that would fuel the devastating fire 2 years later. Outside of fellow workers, though, few in New York City took much notice. But the deaths of those young working people in 1911 horrified many and galvanized some to action. Schneiderman gave a stirring address at a protest rally at the Metropolitan Opera House a week after the fire. She was a short woman with fiery red hair and with a voice that carried throughout the Met in an era without electronic amplification. She spoke of the tragedy, of the cause of the fire. Yes, a cigarette in the waste paper barrel, most likely. But even more, the owners regularly locked the exits and refused even to talk with the union organizers working to improve wages and safety conditions. Al Smith, later to become governor of New York and in 1928 the first Catholic to run for the presidency of the United States, but then a Democratic majority leader in the state assembly, also became seriously involved. He organized a legislative commission to investigate the deaths of those working people, which met for 4 years every Saturday except during the summer following the tragedy. Although the commission was formally empowered only to investigate how to prevent disasters, I'm sorry, I just lost my place. In New York workplaces, the members expanded their mission over those 4 years to discuss and report all kinds of unsafe conditions and on other issues that could be harmful to employees: long hours, low wages, child labor, forced homework after a 10-hour workday being among them. Slowly, incrementally, in the aftermath of the fire, some change began, if not to be accomplished, began a process of attempting to do that. Another person was also deeply touched by the Triangle tragedy, a young 31-year-old woman born in Maine, raised in Boston and Worcester, Massachusetts. She graduated from Mount Holyoke in 1902 with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and physics, and in 1911 she headed the New York Consumers League had already headed it for over a year and had begun also to publicly press for better working conditions, higher wages, and even unionization of workers, male and female. She did not know Rose Schneiderman nor Al Smith before the Triangle disaster, but she soon would. Her name was Frances Perkins. Perkins was visiting a friend that Saturday in March 1911 who lived across Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, not far from the Triangle building. The screech of the fire engines, the screams of the jumpers, and the paralyzed, helpless cries of bystanders brought them across the park, and they too became stunned spectators of the horror of witnessing the jumpers. Quote, "They began to jump," Perkins recalled in a 1964 lecture at Cornell. "The window was too crowded and they would jump and they hit the sidewalk. The net broke. A terrible distance, the weight of the bodies was so great at the speed at which they were traveling that they broke through the net. Every one of them was killed. Everybody who jumped was killed. It was a horrifying spectacle." Frances Perkins was not the only person that day whose life was transformed by the Triangle fire. Al Smith, a practiced politician but also a caring one, realizing the numbers of victims who lived in his electoral district, that was also his own neighborhood, began the painful task of visiting the families who had lost loved ones. Rose Schneiderman, who gave the galvanizing speech, only intensified her commitment to working people in the years to come. So too, in a different fashion, did Perkins. She resigned her position with the Consumers League and began to work with other groups to change the conditions that had led to that 1911 disaster. In 1919, Al Smith, then the governor of New York, appointed her to the state's Industrial Commission. A decade later, the newly elected governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, appointed Perkins as the inaugural commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor. She was neither a politician in the mold of Smith or Roosevelt, nor a committed socialist and labor activist, as was Rose Schneiderman. She would exercise, however, a powerful influence on behalf of working people in the decades to follow. The organized labor movement in 1911 was very, very small, both in New York and across the country. But unions that grew in that decade, unions did grow in that decade, particularly during World War I. Although still a distinct minority, the increase encouraged many socialists, syndicalists, and trade unionists to anticipate post-war growth. But the leaders of industry had a different plan. They called it the American Plan, and they coordinated efforts across the nation to eliminate unions where they existed and to prevent union drives where they were not yet established. During the 1920s, they successfully stunted new union growth and eliminated many unions that had gained a foothold amongst working people. They had enormous resources at their disposal: the power of a large corporation, a corporate employer, to dictate policy in industrial towns and cities, the ability to encourage a governor to mobilize the National Guard or to hire private thugs themselves to achieve the same end during a strike. Not insignificantly, between 1921 and 1933, a series of Republican presidents used their power and position to undermine labor's efforts. As if this were not enough, the Great Depression began in the fall of 1929, creating massive unemployment, large-scale homelessness, and a pervasive sense of desperation across the nation. This was the situation Frances Perkins faced as she took up her duties as Commissioner of New York's Department of Labor in 1929. She immediately expanded factory investigation, checking for unsafe, hazardous conditions. Simultaneously, she reduced the work week for women to 48 hours and advocated for a minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and other improvements in working conditions. But as energetic and as effective as she was, her time in Albany would be short. In 1933, her boss, Franklin Roosevelt, became President Roosevelt and appointed her Secretary of Labor, a position she held for 12 years. She was the first woman to hold a cabinet post and thus the first also to be in the presidential line of succession. Roosevelt knew the character of the woman he had appointed and was not disappointed in Perkins's actions. Perkins helped create legislation on minimum wage policy, the National Labor Relations Act, the Social Security Act, and was the chairwoman of the President's Commission on Economic Security, which created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the successful federal effort to employ large numbers of the unemployed to work repairing and developing America's infrastructure and parks. Amidst all of this work, she also managed the Department of Labor's aggressive interventions in the world of work. It was during these years, between 1933 and Roosevelt's death in 1945, that the Roosevelt administration, with a major role played by Perkins, created the legal structure to allow, indeed to encourage, trade union organizing. And the percentage of the labor force in unions grew significantly, particularly in such mass production industries as auto and steel and coal, among others. The post-war economy created further gains by labor. By 1950, about 25% of workers in the private sector were organized, and the number in the public sector, in local, state, and federal government jobs, was growing as well. While the Triangle Fire was not a national touchstone sparking union organizing in the post-war years, local labor defeats and tragedies embedded in the collective memory of those working-class communities across the nation often were. But there were also some disturbing developments that arose, not for the first time in American history. Racism, the singular original sin of the American experiment, continued its dominant influence over Americans across all economic categories. As the United Auto Workers experienced extraordinary growth during the 1930s, for example, the limited number of African Americans allowed into the union were segregated into the worst jobs in the auto plant, particularly in the paint shop, with its intense heat and splattering hot paint. As more and more Southern blacks migrated into Detroit, Chicago, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, and New York, escaping the meticulously organized, deeply ingrained racism of the Deep South, they most often encountered the South's northern variant, a racism less systematic but capable of thorough exclusion as well as fierce violence. As African Americans sought more positions in Detroit's numerous union factories, in auto and other industries, white union workers organized what they called hate strikes, where white union men refused to work with black would-be union men. The white antagonism spread to other areas in Detroit life as well. On June 20th, 1943, a warm, sunny day in the middle of a war, white youths attacked blacks at Bell Island, a lakeside recreation site, chanting, "Kill them, with intense, ugly, racist phrasing. The riot that ensued engulfed the city. Large groups of whites, a majority working people, took to the streets for 2 days, attacking any African American on sight for the crime of their color. 35 people died, 25 of them African American, and 1 policeman. Nearly 700 were injured, and $2 million in 1943 of property damage occurred. By 1957, no other riot had yet taken place, but blacks remained less than 2% of the workers in the skilled trades in auto. I focused on the UAW in this discussion precisely because of all of the unions then existing. It was widely regarded, and I might say accurately so, as one of the most liberal, militant, and sensitive to the demands of its members. In that sense, it serves as a benchmark of the limited positions even a progressive union would accept at that time when the issue was race. The post-war years seemed at first rather inauspicious for organized labor. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 placed serious restrictions on labor's organizing efforts, and the foul patriotic appeal of Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist fever attracted many in and out of the labor movement. But even more dominant in framing American consciousness was the reality that America was the only power that survived World War II with its industrial infrastructure intact, with a vast domestic consumer market, and with the opportunity, many observers thought, to dominate the war-torn economies of Europe, Russia, and Japan, as no nation had ever been capable of doing before. With the economic future seemingly bright, 2 major areas of concern remained. The first, with the death of Roosevelt in April of 1945, was, would the nation's politics follow his path, or would there be a reaction against the New Deal, such as calls for a return to policies more conservative than liberal, more individually focused than class actions intended to uplift large groups of citizens. Labor remained a strong force for the 30 years following World War II, but a deeper look into the politics of these years suggests that trouble lay ahead. In 1943, a large group of white evangelicals from all sections of the nation met and formed the National Association of Evangelicals with the mission to convert Americans to Christ, to preach the gospel of individualism, freedom, and salvation, and to fight godless communism with the power of God's truth and capitalism's secular promise. 2 years later, Billy Graham, then a young, recently ordained Baptist minister, took to the pulpit to preach both of personal redemption and national salvation by following the path of righteousness. In a career that lasted more than 55 years, years of active touring and preaching, Graham advised presidents and preached an individualistic faith grounded in the sanctity of free market principles. And I might also add that Billy Graham late into the 1950s to integrate his own preaching practice. In 1948, the deeply conservative, openly racist Democratic senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, ran for the presidency on a segregationist platform. His loss was nonetheless something of a victory in that he legitimized in the South, and for many in the North as well, the attitudes he preached. And then in 1955, William F. Buckley and Friends first published National Review, a journal of conservative opinion and debate that encouraged a stronger analysis of politics and culture than what many on the right had previously developed. It would become a tremendous recruiting tool in the post-war revival of American conservatism. We most often think of the 1960s as a decade of free love, Dylan and the Beatles, the civil rights movement, student rebellion, the first stirrings of what would become a powerful modern feminist movement, and of course, opposition to the war in Vietnam and to the draft. And it was that, but it was also something else too. Barry Goldwater, the Arizona senator who represented conservative thought in politics at the time, lost his 1964 race for the presidency to Lyndon Johnson, but achieved two major gains for the conservative movement. First, it was through his campaign that younger conservative activists got a greater sense that they were not a small minority amidst the liberals, but rather had a power and a growing one on the right. Second, Goldwater's invitation to a fading Hollywood actor, a former Democrat now turned conservative Republican, to give a TV speech introducing the presidential candidate did not win the race for Goldwater, but it gave birth to a new political force, Ronald Reagan. There's no time tonight to cover in detail the political history from 1969 to the 80s, but let me note just 2 points. Reagan would become the most conservative president in almost 50 years. And second, it is a mistake to forget the impact of George Corey Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who in the presidential primaries of 1968 and 1972 especially made significant inroads amongst working people, union and non-union, Southern and Northern. Beyond the political arena, however, lay even stronger forces. Since 1939-1940, the American economy, with its occasional dips, grew enormously. The production facilities grew more sophisticated, employed more workers, even as it explored new technologies, and corporate leaders were obsessed with producing more for less. In the early 1960s, a small group on the political left, embracing what they called the Triple Revolution, saw in this coming millennium where robotic machines would produce all manner of goods and freely elected distributive state would provide citizens with their livelihood while they explored a wide range of interests. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. The first inclination of what was to come gained national attention early in the 1980s. Protests in Detroit and at other auto plants called for a ban on all Japanese cars imported into the United States. Tension grew. Some union workers of Japanese descent faced harassment, and at least one was killed in a Detroit bar frequented by auto workers. But the directors of the major companies in steel, auto, and other industries had a plan in mind to achieve their goals. They would follow the pattern of much of the clothing industry in the 1920s and build new plants in the American South. The South was a low-wage, largely non-union, indeed significantly anti-union, and thus attractive. From a Southern governor's perspective, this in-migration provided jobs, boosted the economy, and for a number of years largely observed the unspoken rules about not hiring black workers in any significant numbers. But as important as this Southern migration was, the technological transformation of work proved even more powerful. In 1960, 24% of the American labor force, union and non-union, worked in manufacturing. In 2017, that figure was 8%, and the production level was far above 1960 levels. One aspect of this, of course, was technological innovation. From Frederick Winslow Taylor's late 19th century crude but effective efforts to transform working men in steel into machine-like entities, the primacy of industrial efficiency became the keystone to corporate policy. Moving plants to the American South also provided corporate leaders with the opportunity to introduce the latest technology. Whether the product was autos, steel, clothing, or other products, the goal was to produce the greatest number of products at the cheapest cost, thereby boosting corporate profits. Nor did this process occur solely within an American framework. Japanese and various European manufacturers, in auto and in the mini steel plants especially, established production firms in the American South, where they were given financial incentives by local and state governments and were protected by low minimum wage requirements and the absence of laws supporting union organizing. There was, as well, a successful effort by many businessmen to move production out of the United States, in whole or in part, in search of lower costs. The finished autos that currently roll off Detroit assembly lines contain major parts that are constructed in Mexico and Canada. But, as is our fate these days in America, it is the Trump family that captures the essence of this problem. The president-elect made much of saving all 114 jobs at the Carrier plant in Indiana during the campaign. The company would not move to Mexico, he vowed. And then, after the inauguration, came the news that, well, about 800 jobs would in fact leave. Earlier this year, we learned that indeed, Carrier will be closing the plant and shifting all of the jobs. Not to be outdone in this effort, however, the president's daughter, Ivanka, agreed to the shift of her elite shoe factory in Dongguan, China, where workers were making the equivalent of $480 a month, to Ethiopia, where the monthly salary was $100. In both shoe factories, as with Carrier, each migration brings new levels of labor-saving technology. This process has been at work in the United States since the 1960s. While new jobs are created, they most often require skills that the displaced workers simply do not have. Further, the number of employees necessary for a unit of production, even in as complex a process as auto machinery, has been drastically reduced through technological advancement. This raises the final question. Given all that has occurred in the last 50-plus years, how did so many working people vote for Donald Trump in 2016? Further, how, if the polls are accurate, are so many still supportive as we move towards the 2018 elections? I do not have an answer to that question. At times, I am, like you, I'm certain, I'm simply confused, if not dumbfounded. But I want to share with you someone who does have a grasp on this issue and is a grasp grounded deeply in her work with white Southern working people and informed by her genuine effort to understand them and not simply to impose her thinking. The author is Arlie Russell Hochschild, and the book is Strangers in Their Own Land. It's just out now in paperback. It had been published last year. The book does not answer every question one might have, but it is a brilliant, I think, sensitive effort to understand the complex and contradictory reactions of Americans today who have suffered from the process I have briefly discussed and yet reach out towards the current president for guidance and solutions. Let me end this talk, which began with triangle and closed with Trump, with the words of a man I deeply respect. In a speech he gave in Utah in 1910, but which he used frequently throughout his long career as an American socialist activist. Eugene V. Debs said the following, and I quote directly, "I am not a labor leader. I do not want you to follow me or anyone else. If you're looking for a Moses to lead you out of this capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I would not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I could lead you in, somebody else can lead you out. You must use your heads as well as your hands and get yourself out of your present condition." That is what Debs tried to do, what Rose Schneiderman tried to do, what Francis Perkins tried to do, what untold numbers of non-famous Americans have tried to do. And I would suggest it remains our task today to draw from the past to focus on the present. Thank you.
A moment for technology, please. You ready for a little more? No? Did someone say no? Oh my God. Pressure is on after Nick. Okay. Can I have audio from the computer? You really don't want that. Let's try again. I promise it worked about a half an hour ago. Plugged in. I didn't unplug it, I put it to sleep. No, it's definitely not on mute. Matt just moved something with them. Sorry, team. I think we're getting it. Oh wait, I don't know what you just did. I wasn't all the way up, I was like midway.
Nothing changed on my end, so something has changed here.
Quick restart. We're doing a restart. Okay.
Thank you for your patience while we're hitting the virtual reboot.
One second. Thank you for your patience. Each year on the March 25th anniversary of the Triangle Fire, someone steps outside her home into the streets of New York. She might cross the Lower East Side or head uptown to East Harlem or the Bronx. Perhaps she pushes out to Brownsville or to the small buildings in the West Village. Arriving at the home of one of the Triangle Factory fire dead, she bends to the pavement and in thick sidewalk chalk inscribes a name. Sylvia Eisenberg, 17 years old, lived at 14 East 1st Street, died March 25th, 1911 in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She posts a flyer nearby to share the story of the fire, then moves on to another home, another name. Across the city, more people are moving into the streets. Each of the 146 names will be remembered. Building after building, block after block, the human cost of the Triangle Fire is marked across the city. So first, thank you all for your patience with the technology. Thank you to Jonathan Boyerin and Alyssa Sampson, the Cornell Jewish Studies, ILR School at Cornell, Center for Jewish History, American Jewish Historical Society, Nick and Cheryl Barato. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work. I'm an artist. I make a lot of work with the public. And almost all the projects that I make have to do with going from an inner world of dream or thought or feeling to a public world of action. And my interest is in why sometimes that is absolutely impossible to do. We are stuck and unable to do even the simplest tasks to act on what we believe in. And in other times in our life, it's completely smooth and easy, and we can just speak out and do what we need to do. And it's my belief that that journey from our inner world to an outer world is a muscle. And if you don't exercise it, it won't be strong. And when the moment comes when you need to take a stand, you'll be unable to do so. So my work is about creating experiences of that journey so that we can take a stand, especially now. So Nick really covered all the historical parts of the Triangle Fire, but I think it's an important part of the ritual that we go through the story to some degree. So I'm just going to go through visually the fire. This is the 9th floor. This is the 10th floor. This is the fire escape. This is another view of the fire escape. This is the crowd that gathered. This is the pavement they crashed through. These are the witnesses. This is the scene. These are some of the triangle dead. So when I come to projects that have to do with memorialization, there's a tension about will the Memorialization Act to subdue the conversation, to say that everything's all solved now and we can all move forward, or is it going to incite action? And both of those things are always possible when you could create memorials. And it's very similar to how as artists, when we make work, there's always the story of what you're making. It could be the plot of a film or the story in a novel. But there's also always another conversation going on between the maker and the participant. And it's the nature of that conversation. Is the artist treating the viewer as if they are an intelligent, passionate, engaged person, or are we spoon-feeding them as if they're stupid and ignorant and need to be led through each stage? And it's the nature of that other overarching conversation which often really shapes the experience people have of the artwork that we create. In the aftermath of the Triangle Fire, there was an immediate fight about how this event was going to be remembered. The art historian Ellen Wiley Todd has done a lot of research, and she talks about how immediately the city fathers wanted to control the outrage. And so instead of letting the unions or the Hebrew Free Burial Society bury the unidentified dead, they said, no, 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 you guys, we need decorum. And so we're going to take these bodies out to a cemetery way out on the border between Brooklyn and Queens and bury them in our own proper way. And the organizers, Rose Schneiderman and many others, said, no, go ahead, you can do that, but we're going to have a public march. And they took empty hearses through the streets of New York, and hundreds of thousands of people were in the street. And I think that model, the Rose Schneidermans, the Clara Lemlich saying, I have something to say, the Pauline Newmans, they called on us to remember not with thoughts and prayers of 1911, but to remember through action. So when it came time that I wanted to create a piece about the Triangle Fire, it was in 2004. I think as a city, we were still thinking a lot about September 11th, 2001, and being witnesses to a tragedy which we could do nothing about by the time it happened. And I was working in film, and I had a whole series of incredibly bad ideas of movies I could make about the Triangle Fire. And they were all quite sentimental and maudlin, and none of them had a spirit of what I wanted to do. I was thinking a lot about memorialization. I was thinking a lot about how we say never forget, and we will always remember. But in fact, if you've experienced grief or loss, it's a more complicated thing. The minute you lose somebody, you're in a tension, because as you're trying to hold them, their voice, their smell, the sense of them, you are also constantly losing bits of them. And in a sense, you have to let go of them in order to live in your life, live in your own time. But they're so precious to you that you don't want to do that release. And I think when we're making memorials, we have to hold that tension about grief as we do it. In 2004, we were at war in 2 countries, although you could walk through the city and never know that. There was many people suffering economically, but it was still seen very much as an individual problem. And in this time, David von Drelly's book, Triangle, The Fire That Changed America, came out. And in the back of the book, he created the first modern list of the victims of the fire and how they died and who identified them and where they lived. And as soon as I read his book, I finally knew what my project would be. And so I emailed about 30 friends of mine and said, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we went to the homes where the triangle workers lived and we chalked their name and age in front of their home. And in all the years since then, the mechanics of the project have essentially remained the same. I send out an email once a year inviting people to participate. There's no general meeting. I haven't met most of the chalkers, but we just communicate through email, and I send them an assignment with names and ages and a PDF of a flyer. And they're on their own to go into the streets and to remember the triangle worker. The memorial is purposely ephemeral. It's chalk. It will wash away quite quickly, but it makes it so that the memorial will only exist if people are willing to go in the public and make a transgressive act. So each year, we have to come back and prove that we remember, or the memorial will not exist. It's also an act we do with our bodies. As women, as feminists, we know we have to connect our bodies with our actions. And when you go down on the pavement to chalk, there's a boomerang that happens with our own childhood where we're remembering being in the street. And you're also looking at the building, at that door that she might have walked through, at the window that might have been her room. You're connecting not just to the death of the worker, but to her life. She was a striver. Perhaps you see another chalk marking down the street. Were they friends? Did they walk to work together? And as you do that, you can imagine both the community of the past of all these young workers going to the Triangle Fire to work, and also the contemporary community of people who are passionate enough about this event that took place 100 years ago, but they'll still go in the streets to take a stand. By now, I have people chalking from the family members, people who live in the buildings now, people who come to this event through their identities as Jews, as Italian Americans, through fire and safety, through the labor movement. This year we had over 100 teams going all over the city to chalk the triangle workers. And I think one of the things about this project and the way it reflects from the past to the present, this is a photograph of many young garment workers, and you can see their arms linked with each other. And these are young chalkers from a school up in the Bronx. Their teacher, Mary Beth Whitehouse, leads them to chalk every year, and they too have this linked arm, this thing that girls do with each other. And I was so moved over the years by how many people were willing to participate. And by about 2008, I realized that in 2011 would be the centennial of the fire. And I wanted to be able to bring together all these people who were willing to participate. So I thought we should do something, was about as sophisticated as my idea was at that time. And I called for a meeting, and it was about 15 or 20 of us, and we had a bunch of whiteboards, and we brainstormed, and we had all these fabulous ideas, and maybe we should try to get legislation passed for the centennial, maybe we should do a permanent memorial, and everything seemed possible. And then for about the next year, we continued to meet and basically had the same exact conversation. Very little seemed to be happening. Our group got smaller and smaller, until finally we realized that we had to take our belief that this was something people would be passionate about into the public and see if people really cared about it. So we decided to have an event at Judson Church, and the one rule for the event was that it would not be boring. Because so many times we go to events where we believe in it, but it's a little boring. So instead of designing and controlling everything ourselves, we decided to have only 2 speakers. One was a Triangle family member who shared the experience of his family, and the other was me. And I was encouraging people to dream as big as possible. Because in my experience, when you do these projects, a lot of people will tell you to be modest and realistic in order to get something done. And by the time you get modest and realistic, it's not even worth doing anymore. And any of these projects take an enormous amount of energy. So you have to really want to dream big, aim high, and if you fall a little, it's okay. So at the Judson Church, we just filled long tables up, set up many long tables, and invited everyone we knew from the community to participate. And because we were a diverse group, we had the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, we had Blue Stocking Books, we had performance artists, we had Jewish and Italian American groups. All kinds of people came to this event, and organically, people started talking to each other 2 years before the centennial about what they might do in order to participate in the centennial of the Triangle Fire. And it was through that we also discovered who we were. That it was not our job to control people and tell them what to do. It was our job to provide the glue for everybody else to do what they knew best. And we could trust that with all this diversity, everybody would know what their community wanted and needed for the centennial. We next reached out to the Workers United, which is the granddaughter of ILGWU, and said, hey, we want to collaborate. And they said, great, come to the Labor Day parade. So we built 146 shirtwaists with the name sashes, and those shirtwaists continue to this day. They show up at all kinds of labor events, and it began a very fruitful collaboration with the unions. In a very short period of time, we ended up with over 200 partners nationwide. And I would say that there was 3 rules that we found to run our organization. The first was radical tolerance. It did not matter who you were, what you believed in. If you were passionate about the Triangle Fire, you were welcome. And we started having monthly meetings where we were having 80 or 100 people showing up, and lots of people who do not get along, and we just made them work before they could have a conversation, and then we could get things done. The second rule was that we would be beholden to no one. Because we were not an institution, we could do things quickly and efficiently and in response to what people wanted. So for example, we started seeing on Facebook, people were uncovering all kinds of beautiful things that should be preserved. And so we thought, oh, we need an open archive. So we created an open archive on our website where people could submit letters, pictures, all these things that they were finding. The third rule we had was that the workers make the decisions. And that was a good way to get rid of the people who wanted to control things but not do the work. A lot of the work of these organizations, as we know, is, I would say it's about 95% data entry. By the centennial, we had performances all over the country, puppet opera, craft actions, people knitting things, academic symposiums, bell ringing. We had everybody ringing bells at 4:45, the time the fire started, and thousands of people to join the union in the street.
Good morning, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Edgar Romney from Workers United, and thank you so much for being here today. 100 years ago, on this very day, there was a fire where 146 young men and women lost their lives because the doors were locked and they couldn't get out. Many of them died in the fire escapes. Many of them had to jump out the window. And it is our obligation and responsibility to make sure we never forget what happened to those 146 workers.
Representing the descendants of the Triangle victims.
What a fantastic crowd. You give testimony and new meaning to Francis Perkins' words. They did not die in vain, and we will never forget them. Let this Triangle Fire Centennial be a call to all of us to rededicate our energies, raise our voices, and become more active in the pursuit of justice for all working people. We stand with you from Wisconsin to Bangladesh in solidarity. Thank you.
That was Suzanne Pred-Bass, who's here in the audience tonight, and her great-aunt Rosie perished in the fire, and her great-aunt Katie survived. So that was 7 years ago. And now Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition continues, and they are building a memorial on the building, which is 1 block east of Washington Square Park. And I warmly encourage everybody to get involved and get this built so that nobody can pass that building without knowing what happened inside. But I would also encourage people to get involved in the sense of, once the memorial is there, what is it going to mean? And is it going to mean that we've solved these problems of labor and so forth, and we can happily move on with our lives? Or is it going to be an incitement to action? And we have so many things now. The way garment workers are treated in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza, the way immigrants are treated today. So how this memorial is built is, I think, equally as important as that it is built. About a year after the centennial, I gave a talk on the Triangle Fire, and a woman approached me afterwards, and she was very upset. And it took me a while to figure out what was bothering her. And it turned out that what she was upset about was that I had mentioned in my talk that the owners of the Triangle Fire, as well as the lawyer that got them off, were Jewish. And she had come to the talk wanting to be connected with her history as a Jewish woman with the rabble-rousers like Clara Lemlich and Rose Schneiderman. But the difficulty in that moment is, if you come to the Triangle Fire through your identity as a Jewish person, you both get those wonderful labor organizers to your credit, but you do also get the owners. And I think that difficult history is actually extremely important to us in the time we're living in now. We're all of us a multiplicity of identities, both oppressors and victims, in all kinds of complicated ways. And the Triangle Fire, there's one thing I've learned, is that it often has great gifts to give us if we look deeply into the story. And you will see that. So, for example, in the uprising of 20,000, which happened just before the Triangle Fire, it was women organizers who pushed back against their male comrades in order to insist that women could organize and hold a strike. And that was a very powerful moment and of coming together, but also fighting each other. The same thing was during the strike, there was many cross-class alliances between working-class women and middle and upper-class women who came together for the strike, but could only hold it together for so long before they broke apart, because they couldn't hold that together. And I think that those tensions of how do we come together across our differences, whether they're class or gender, what nationality, religion, that is the part of the story that speaks to me now. Because there's so much that we do not see. I think this is a moment that we all know is historic, that we're living in right now. There's enormous violence around us against communities of color through mass incarceration, Islamophobia, domestic violence, immigrants. Even Obama deported 2 million people. And there's a great silence about a lot of our history. We have yet to have a national conversation about the genocide on which our country was founded. We have yet to have a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission or an actual conversation about reparations for slavery. We drench the world in weapons through our companies. As Jews, I think we constantly find it incredibly difficult to have a deep and engaged conversation about Israel-Palestine. It's so painful. People explode apart before they can get anywhere. And in this moment, when you know it's historic, it's hard to find ways to move forward. And I would like to especially reach out now to my fellow artists and makers here, because I think it's our imaginative world, especially, that is under assault right now. The loss of privacy impedes our space for imagination. And in that moment, we really need art, because that can create a space for these really difficult conversations to take place. But there's I think, a panic button that people go into where they want to make things that tell people what to do, better things to do, who they should be. And I take what Nick said, very quoting Debs, very deeply, that we cannot tell people what to do. We have to contribute to each other's empowerment so that we all can act on our best selves. And those of us who are making socially engaged art, I think there can be an ironic way that can take us away from our own truth. There's so many of us, women and people of color, who are told that we should be serving others, that sometimes we go down that road and we're not actually being truthful to our own voice. And in fact, what the world might need is a cacophony of our voices slamming out and joining and showing that other things are possible right now. We are already creating our future. It is coming at us, and we are building it right now, even unconsciously, in ways that we are not quite clear on. And it's extremely important that that future not be just in reaction to the toxins in the world we exist in, but also be fiercely imaginative of what we can create for this next world that is definitely coming towards us. I would like to thank my co-conspirators, Nick and Cheryl and Alyssa. Thank you for listening. My book will be on sale out in the lobby. Please buy it so I don't have to carry it home tonight. It's the fight of our lives. We know there's great violence coming, both against us, our communities, and in our name against others. It's going to take an enormous amount of bravery to do the things we're going to have to do. I'll see you in the streets. Thank you.
Technical test. I'd like to thank our two speakers, and I'd like to tie this Q&A panel back to the question of past activism and how it affects our actions today. And then I'd like, after each speaker answers a question, I'd like to open it up to the audience. So with your permission, I'm going to start with a person who has not actually addressed us before, Cheryl. And I have a question for you, Cheryl. Okay. Can you tell the audience about the Keel Center and how you work with the public? Cheryl's the director, so it's probably a good question for her. And looking back over the years that you've been directing the Keel Center, what can you tell us about how its archives have helped shape contemporary awareness of the Triangle Fire's legacy?
Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Cheryl Brado. I'm the director of the Keel Center for Labor Management, Documentation, and Archives. Can you hear me okay? No? Yes? Yes? No? Okay. And so the first question is how we engage the public. And first of all, I loved this introductory remark from the program director about a sleepy street in Chelsea being home to archives that are open to the public, and inviting all of you to come visit and see what you can find and learn. And it's the same thing at the Keel Center. The Keel Center is on the Cornell campus in Ithaca, New York, and it's free and open to the public, and it's home to a lot of the documentation that that historians and artists and the general public use to understand the Triangle Fire. And being in Ithaca, New York, what we've found is that a good way to interact with the public is through the Triangle Fire website, which gets millions of hits every year and is a big stop for school kids doing National History Day projects on the Triangle Fire. And a good entryway to learning not only about the fire, but about the legislation that followed, issues around immigration and work that pertained to the era, and an entryway into other sources. So, there's kind of a mix of people coming into the archives and also engaging with the materials that we have available online, and that's something that I invite all of you to do as well.
Nick, you spoke very convincingly, if not optimistically, I would say, about the history of labor in the 20th century. But I'm going to ask you to do something that's also difficult. Take that strike of 1909, the uprising of the 20,000, and tie that back as well as to the legacy of activism after the fire itself, to contemporary activism, and what resources and what lessons does that give us for the future?
I think I would disagree, I think, with the premise, because 1909 or 1911 and 2018 are two very different eras, to say the least. And you just think of the way in which technology has transformed the very nature of work. And I think that's the difficulty that the union movement, I'm a former Teamster myself, but the difficulty that I got fired from the Teamsters for not following policy, but it's true. I mean, I was fired from the company with the Teamster, by the Teamsters. Anyway, the point is that the problem is that the numbers, since 1983, the labor movement has been consistently losing numbers. And they've done it for, not because they've given up, not because they've tried, yeah, let me just get something here as a statistic. In 1987, there were something like, can't even read my own handwriting, 35.9% of workers in the public sector and about 23% of workers in the private sector in manufacturing were in trade unions. Those same figures for 2017, 9.1% in manufacturing and a drop of 34% in to 34%, so it's a small drop in public sector. But the problem is this, is that where the unions have lost percentages or where they've gained percentages have been largely due to changes in the economy, not due to organizing drives. There have been organizing drives, I do understand that, but the major pressure has really come from outside, both positive and negative in terms of what its effect on the labor movement. I don't find, and I'm not happy to say this, but I don't find a successful model and at times even a useful discussion coming out of a lot of the labor organizers that I've come across. And I'm sorry, I know it's depressing, I know I'm probably, somebody's thinking he's really some right-wing fanatic, but I'm not. As I say, I've put my time in trade unions as a member, and so, but that's where I would be.
I think all caveats about comparing the present to the past as analogous stand. Nonetheless, you did tell us some inspirational quotes, so don't feel you're entirely a downer on that topic. Quoting from Debs is a time-honored tradition in New York.
I would go with just one last thing. I use that quote particularly because I love it, because when I first came across it, I was stunned by it when I was doing research on the Debs book years ago. Because what it did was it ultimately spoke to the depth of individualism in America and said you got to use that to become a collective. And that's the takeaway message. And I think it's a powerful message. Not certain we've done it all that well.
Ruth, for you, I have a different type of question, since you are the storyteller par excellence. So tell us, why is it how we tell stories of the past? Why is that critical to activism?
Because we need every bit of help we can get, maybe. I mean, I think that's how we find the strength to get through. The class just left, the Williamsburg High School for Architecture and Design, and I spoke to them about the Triangle Fire last year, and one of the students asked me at the end, if you had not gotten positive feedback to chalk, would you have continued it? Because I've been doing the project since 2004 now, and I was really stunned by that question, and I've thought about it a lot, because the work we do is really hard. I don't actually consider myself an activist. I think those people are much more generous and noble than I am. And I think when we're trying to find ways to survive through this, it is those stories that can give us the strength to keep going and ways to communicate with each other across other kinds of differences, I would say.
I'd like to invite questions from the audience.
Okay, I'll start here, and then here maybe we'll do about maybe like 3 questions. Okay. Thank you, speakers. It was a wonderful presentation. The question I think is probably mostly to Nick. Your story about Rose Schneiderman was that I had not heard of her, so that was really interesting. And so the question is, I can't help but wonder, is there a relation with Eric Schneiderman?
I have no idea. I really don't know.
One more thing.
All right. For the Yiddish speakers in the audience, what does Schneiderman mean?
Taylor.
Right.
Okay. All right. My other quick question is, what is or was the address of the Triangle Factory?
It's on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, 1 block east of Washington Square Park. And there's a plaque on the building, you can see.
And it's part of NYU today. It's part of NYU.
Yes,
Brown Building.
yes.
It's on Green Street, but it's the Brown Building. Honest.
Thank you for all the talks and information. I'd like to ask a question about the women and the men, Jewish and Italian, about what allowed their families, I don't know if that's the right word, to allow them at this young age to move from working in the tenements to working in these new modern buildings. I think at one point, Nick, you may have said to me it was different for Italian and Jewish families. Maybe I misheard that. But allowing women to move into a workplace and the appearance that it was safer, of course, but also where it comes in economically, but also socially, and where families were opening up, leaving the home where the sewing machine was.
I'll go first.
Cheryl.
I think a lot of the immigrants, a lot of these young women were the breadwinners for their families. And so the families were devastated, both emotionally and financially. The owners got insurance money and made a profit off this. And a lot of them were also living fairly secular lives, I would say also, which is also a question that has come up because they were working on a Saturday. But that's, Triangle Factory was actually a modern factory for the day. It was not considered a sweatshop. It was considered very lucky to get to work there because they were very successful, so you were much less likely to get fired. And I would say one thing about the amazing collection at the Kiel Center is there's other information there that is not so much out in the public. Like one of the owners would ask women to stay after. And we know what that means now, but that wasn't even in Leonstein's book because of the time it was written, so there's a lot more to be uncovered.
Yeah, I would second that in the sense that I really do think that the economics drove it. I mean, the families were dirt poor, and the wages were low. Even if another person in the family was working, if you had a family of 4 or 5. That was a lot of mouths to feed, and one salary couldn't do it. And so I think that was a major impetus at first. And I think you're right, too. I mean, that Triangle seemed to be the modern place, if you will, at that time.
Hi, thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. This is an observation, though. Yesterday, in a place of storytelling very near the Triangle Factory, I attended a salon at the Public Theater about the march on Saturday. And there were 3 young activist speakers who were fabulous, 3 artists. Okay, I tried to get a hold of the person running it beforehand, and she had no time for me. There was no interaction. There was no Q&A afterwards, but I got to her afterwards, and I said, you know, this is the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And she basically said to me, oh, what's that? And I think that's what is missing for the folks that are coming up in the line is, you know, to look at history and to understand what the history was all about. And that connection really hasn't been made yet. But hopefully, maybe next year, these 2 groups will talk to each other.
Annie, you have the mic.
Thank you. This was so wonderful. I just want to say one quick thing on that note of education. I saw in the audience tonight Mei Chen, who was the vice president of ILDWU Unite, and she was in charge of education. And one of the things she did is she ensured that the workers, the Chinese primarily garment workers in the 70s and 80s, knew about the fire. And so in my former position at the Tenement Museum, when I was interviewing a Chinese garment worker, Mrs. Wang, and I said to her, you know, what did you know about the Jewish immigrants that used to live in these tenements? And she said, the fire. They made sure that there were unions so there wouldn't be a fire because of the kind of the education she had. So I just wanted to shout out to the education, whether it's in unions or whether it's today in schools, and echoing what you're saying to keep alive these ideas, and that education is a form of activism as well. So thank you all.
And I'm going to invite everybody here to a reception outside.
Just one little note. Tomorrow we're having an event as part of the History Matters series. The American Jewish Historical Society and the Center for Jewish History. Dr. Annie Poland is going to interview, she's our new executive director at the AJHS. She's going to interview Todd Gitlin. You're very, very welcome to come to that tomorrow at 7. We have flyers outside. Please take one, and you'll have all the information and also little feedback cards. We want to know what kind of programming you want to see here. Please leave a note, your name, your email, and stay and hang out and talk to us and mingle. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.